Have you ever wondered what happens inside your soul when you begin to ignore the gentle voice of God? Have you felt moments when your heart grows quieter, colder, less moved by the things that once brought you to tears? And have you ever feared that your silence toward God might provoke his silence toward you? These questions open the door to a mystery Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux understood with striking clarity, a mystery she lived with tenderness, simplicity, and a spiritual intuition deeper than her years. When a soul stops listening to God, something profound happens, and something unexpected, something gentle, and something far more loving than we often imagine. Hook. When a soul no longer listens, God does not withdraw. He leans closer, with a love so quiet it can only be heard by the humble. Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux. Before we continue, subscribe if you wish to walk this little way with us and rediscover how God speaks in even the smallest moments of your life. Sainte Thérèse knew that God does not punish silence. He does not strike the heart that forgets him. He does not abandon the one whose attention has wandered. Instead, he does something infinitely more tender. He waits. And in his waiting, he surrounds the soul with small invitations, subtle, soft, and hidden in the everyday. For Thérèse, God's voice was not thunder. It was not a dramatic revelation. It was not a command shouted from heaven. It was something as subtle as the light on a wall, the kindness of a smile, the patience of a sister in the convent, or the quiet tug of conscience that whispers, "Come back to me." But what happens when the soul stops listening? Thérèse teaches that God does not shout louder. He becomes quieter, not out of frustration, but because love never forces itself. He becomes gentler, because gentleness awakens longing. He becomes smaller, because smallness is the only language a distracted soul can still understand. Imagine Thérèse in the convent corridor. Her heart feels dry, distracted, unable to pray. She sits before the tabernacle with no emotion, no consolation, no spiritual sweetness. And yet she writes, "Jesus sleeps in my boat, and while he sleeps, I remain at peace." This is the secret. When the soul is not listening, God rests, not in disappointment, but in trust. Because love waits. Love hopes. Love believes the soul will return. At times, the silence we experience is not God leaving, it is God trusting. Trusting that our desire, even if faint, will find its way back to him. Trusting that the smallest spark of love still lives inside us. Trusting that even when our ears grow deaf, our hearts remain capable of hearing. Thérèse believed that when a soul stops listening, God begins speaking in a language deeper than words, through events, through simplicity, through longing itself. And that is where our journey begins. When a soul begins to drift from God, not through rebellion but through forgetfulness, distraction, or the slow cooling of love, the first thing God does is something almost invisible. He lowers his voice. Not because he wants to hide, but because whispering is the language that awakens longing. Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux understood this deeply. She often wrote that God's voice is not found in emotional highs or dramatic revelations, but in the softest movements of the heart. When a soul grows inattentive, God does not overwhelm it. He does not force attention. He becomes even quieter, because quietness invites the soul to lean in. Imagine a gentle scene, a small chapel, morning light sliding across the floor. A young nun kneels without feeling, without inspiration, without enthusiasm. Her mind wanders. Her heart feels dull. She barely hears anything in prayer. Yet in that silence, God is not far. He is closer than ever, but his closeness is subtle, like the softness of a breeze brushing past the cheek. Thérèse would say that God lowers his voice because he desires free love, not mechanical devotion. He wants the soul to choose him again, not react automatically out of habit. And so, when the soul stops listening, God gently withdraws the feeling of his nearness so that the soul may awaken its own desire. Think of a mother who whispers to a distracted child. The child must approach, must quiet himself, must lean closer to hear. The whisper is not distance, it is invitation. This is the way of God. When we stop listening, he whispers, not to punish, but to draw, not to condemn, but to awaken, not to create fear, but to inspire longing. Thérèse lived this experience many times. There were seasons when she felt spiritually dry and unable to perceive God's voice. She called these moments "my nights of faith," but rather than seeing them as abandonment, she interpreted them as God's tender way of teaching her to love Him for His sake, not for the sweetness He gives. She wrote, "When Jesus is silent, He is resting in my heart, and I rest in Him." This is one of the most profound truths of the little way. God's silence is not rejection. It is relationship. It is not absence. It is intimacy, hidden under simplicity. It is not anger. It is humility, the humility of a God who chooses not to force Himself on the soul. But there is another thing God does when a soul stops listening, something even more surprising, something almost paradoxical. Rather than pulling away, He surrounds the soul with small signs, hidden invitations woven into ordinary life. When a soul stops listening to God, the second thing He does is one of the most tender mysteries of the spiritual life. He fills the path of that soul with small signs, almost imperceptible invitations, woven into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. These signs are not dramatic. They do not shout. They do not demand. They are gentle, subtle, and deeply respectful of human freedom. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux believed that God hides His invitations in the smallest corners of life, because the soul that no longer listens cannot handle anything louder. She wrote, "God teaches me through little things." And this was not poetic exaggeration. It was her spiritual method, her doctrine, her way of seeing the world. Imagine a day when the soul is distracted, spiritually tired, uninterested in prayer. It wakes up late. It moves through its tasks without awareness. It forgets to pray before meals. It rushes from one thing to another. It feels far from God. And yet, throughout that very day, God is placing small movements along the path. A memory of a time when prayer felt sweet. A sudden peace that lasts 5 seconds. A smile from someone who seems unaware of how needed that smile was. A brief sunset that slows the heart. A phrase overheard that feels strangely relevant. A longing, faint but real, to return. These are not coincidences. For Thérèse, they are God's footsteps. She insisted that God prefers to move through little signs, because little signs can enter places where big signs cannot. A soul that has stopped listening cannot receive thunder, but it can receive a breeze. It can receive a gentle reminder. It can receive a quiet nudge that does not overwhelm but awakens. Picture Thérèse in the laundry room of the convent. She is folding clothes. Her mind is distracted. Her heart feels distant. Then suddenly, she notices a tiny act of charity, a sister offering help, or the soft way the light touches the water in the basin. Something small moves her heart. Nothing dramatic, yet she feels God's presence brushing against her soul. This is how God works when the soul forgets Him, not through loud intervention, but through subtle companionship. Saint Thérèse would say that God becomes like a gardener, placing little seeds along the path, seeds that only need a moment of openness to begin growing. God never forces the door open. Instead, He knocks through ordinary beauty, ordinary tenderness, ordinary grace. And sometimes the soul does not respond. Sometimes it keeps walking without noticing a single sign. Even then, God does not stop planting them, because love is patient, love is creative. Love tries again and again. Thérèse believed that even the smallest movement of longing, even if it lasts a single heartbeat, is enough for God to act. And so He keeps sending these little invitations because He knows that one day, one moment, one quiet second may be enough to wake the soul again. But what happens when even these small signs are ignored? When a soul drifts further, when it not only stops listening but begins to ignore even the small signs God places along its path, something deeper happens. Not something harsh, not something punitive, but something painfully gentle. God allows the soul to experience the emptiness it has chosen. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux knew this intimately. She experienced seasons in which God allowed her to walk through what she called a desert of faith. But unlike the deserts described by mystics of dramatic visions or spiritual warfare, Thérèse's desert was simple, quiet and painfully ordinary. She felt nothing. She sensed nothing. She heard nothing. And yet she never believed this was God abandoning her. Instead, she wrote, "He hides himself so the soul may learn to desire him more." This is the third thing God does when a soul stops listening. He permits a holy emptiness, an interior silence that reveals what the soul is missing. This emptiness is not punishment, it is revelation. Imagine a room filled with beautiful music. You enjoy it, but you never truly notice how precious it is until, suddenly, the music stops. The silence becomes sharp. You feel the absence, you realize what you took for granted. God does something similar with the heart. When we stop listening, He allows us to feel the absence of His consolations so that we may rediscover our hunger for Him. Picture Thérèse walking through her convent routine, sweeping the cloister floor, helping in the infirmary, praying the divine office, yet feeling spiritually numb. She once confessed, "I feel nothing, I see nothing. My faith alone sustains me." This emptiness taught her to love God for Himself, not for the sweetness He gave her. It taught her that desire can be purer than consolation, and it taught her that silence is sometimes God's way of purifying love. Think of your own life. Perhaps there were seasons when prayer felt dry, when you no longer felt moved by Scripture, when Mass felt routine, when your heart felt dull even before the Eucharist. You may have feared you were losing faith, but Thérèse would say, the feeling of loss is itself the sign of longing, and longing is a grace. When the soul stops listening, God sometimes steps back, not to punish, but to allow desire to reawaken from within. This is one of the most tender mysteries of divine love. God respects freedom so deeply that He allows the soul to feel the consequence of forgetting Him, so the soul may decide to return freely. He does not withdraw His presence, only the sense of it. He does not stop loving. He hides His sweetness so love may grow mature. He does not leave. He waits behind the veil of silence. Saint Thérèse understood this with extraordinary clarity. God teaches me to love Him in the dark, but what happens next is something even more tender, something that reveals God's patience to an unimaginable depth. Because when the soul still does not return, God begins to reach through something deeper than emotion or signs. He touches the conscience. When a soul drifts so far that even longing grows faint and silence becomes its new normal, God turns to one of the most delicate instruments of His love, the conscience. Not the harsh, punishing conscience that many imagine, but the gentle interior compass that Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood as the quiet teacher of the soul. This is the fourth thing God does when a soul stops listening. He awakens the conscience with tenderness, not accusation. For Thérèse, conscience was never a voice of fear. It was a voice of invitation, a soft light shining on the smallest choices, the smallest intentions, the smallest movements of the heart. She believed that God speaks through conscience the way a mother touches a child's shoulder, lightly, lovingly, with the hope of drawing the child's gaze upward. Imagine this scene. A person moves through the day without prayer, everything feels dull. They barely notice God. But suddenly, something tiny stirs inside. A brief discomfort after a sharp word spoken, a moment of remorse after selfishness, a sudden awareness that they have been cold, distracted, distant. These small pricks of conscience, brief, interior, nearly invisible, are not guilt. They are grace. Thérèse would say that conscience is God's whisper to the soul that has stopped hearing Him through beauty or peace. When the heart no longer responds to sweetness, God speaks through sincerity. When emotion no longer reaches the soul, God touches intention. When signs go unnoticed, God speaks through interior clarity. And this is important. God does not accuse the soul, He awakens it. Thérèse believed that God never humiliates the soul through conscience. He never crushes, He never wounds. Instead, conscience reveals the truth gently, like a lamp revealing a corner of a room. It is not meant to shame, it is meant to guide. Think of a moment from Thérèse's life. A sister speaks to her harshly. For a brief moment, irritation rises in her. Then she feels a soft inner light, a small invitation. Choose love. This was conscience. This was God. not rebuking her for the irritation, but gently guiding her to rise above it. When the soul stops listening, conscience becomes God's last gentle rope, a way to pull the heart back toward goodness without force, a memory of kindness, a sudden desire to apologize, a longing to pray again, a discomfort with hypocrisy, a quiet sadness after hurting someone. These are not punishments. They are invitations wrapped in tenderness. Thérèse insisted that conscience is a grace precisely because it hurts softly. It is a healing discomfort, one that reveals the gap between where the soul is and where it longs to be. But what happens when even the conscience goes quiet, when the soul is so distant, so numb, that it no longer feels even these gentle nudges? Saint Thérèse reveals something astonishing next. God does something that only divine love would dare to do. He begins to love the soul in a way that it cannot feel, a hidden, faithful, persistent love that surrounds even the coldest heart. When a soul becomes so distant that even conscience grows quiet, something extraordinary happens, something that reveals the depth, the patience, and the absolute fidelity of God's love. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood this mystery not through theology alone, but through the tenderness of her own spiritual experience. The fifth thing God does when a soul stops listening is this: He continues loving the soul in a way the soul can no longer feel. This is one of the most paradoxical truths of the little way. It is also one of the most beautiful. For Thérèse, God's love is not dependent on our spiritual sensitivity. It is not limited by our distractions. It does not diminish when our hearts grow cold. She wrote, "Even when I feel nothing, I know He loves me still." This knowledge did not come from emotion. It came from trust, from confidence, from the certainty that God's love is not reactive, but constant. Imagine a quiet night in the convent. Thérèse sits in her small cell, her candle flickering, her heart dry as desert sand. She tries to pray but feels nothing. No warmth, no sweetness, no inspiration. And yet, she whispers, "Jesus, I believe your love surrounds me even when I do not feel it." This is the essence of divine fidelity. When the soul stops listening, God does not withdraw His love. He withdraws the sensation of love, not to punish but to protect freedom, to deepen desire, to purify intention. But the love itself? It remains, steady, unshaken, unchanging. Thérèse compares God to a mother watching her sleeping child. The child is unaware, unresponsive, silent, but the mother's love does not stop flowing simply because the child does not perceive it. In fact, the love grows even softer in the silence. In the same way, when you stop feeling God, God's love does not shrink. It wraps around you more gently. It holds you in the unseen places. It breathes around the edges of your heart. It keeps watch while you sleep spiritually. Think of your own life. The times you felt far from God, the seasons when prayer felt empty, the days when your heart was numb. Those were not moments of abandonment, they were moments of hidden accompaniment. Thérèse would say, God's greatest love is sometimes felt the least. Why? Because when God hides the emotion of His love, the soul learns to trust the reality of His love. It begins to love Him not for the comfort He gives, but for who He is. It begins to walk by faith, not by feeling. But something else happens during this stage, something that reveals the profound tenderness of God's strategy. As He continues loving the soul invisibly, He also prepares a moment, a specific moment, when He will break the silence in a way the soul cannot miss. This is the sixth thing God does. He orchestrates a moment of surprising grace, a grace meant to awaken, not overwhelm. After long seasons of silence, after subtle signs, after the gentle stirrings of conscience, after loving the soul invisibly, God does something profoundly beautiful, something Saint Thérèse of Lisieux recognized again and again throughout her life. The sixth thing God does when a soul stops listening is this: He prepares a moment of surprising grace, a moment so personal, so timed, so unmistakably tender, that it reaches even the most distant heart. Thérèse believed that God's greatest interventions are never dramatic. They are perfectly timed. She wrote, "Jesus always gives me exactly what I need, at the moment I need it. Not before, not after. exactly when the soul is finally ready to hear again, even if only for a breath. Imagine a soul walking through weeks, months, or even years of spiritual dullness. Prayer feels lifeless, scripture feels distant, mass feels repetitive. There is no sweetness, no inspiration, no interior spark. The person believes God is silent, but God is quietly preparing something underneath. Then one day, without warning, something happens. A phrase in a homily pierces the heart. A line of scripture suddenly feels alive. A long-forgotten memory of grace returns with force. A hymn stirs tears for reasons unknown. A moment of beauty breaks through the numbness. A sunrise, a child's laughter, a sudden peace that lasts only 3 seconds, but feels like eternity. A longing awakens, small, fragile, unexpected, but real. This is not accidental. This is not coincidence. This is the moment God has been preparing, a moment of awakening. Thérèse experienced this often. During her spiritual dryness, she would feel nothing for days. Then suddenly a small grace would break through, the kindness of a sister, a sudden clarity in prayer, an unexpected joy during the most ordinary task. These moments did not last long, but they were strong enough to awaken her desire again. She wrote, "A single ray of His love can change everything." This is how God works. He chooses a moment that only He can see. He chooses a moment when the soul is most likely to soften. He chooses a moment when the smallest spark will mean the most. And here is the beauty. This grace is never loud. It is never violent. It never forces. It comes like a gentle breeze after months of stillness, brief, soft, unmistakable. Many people think these moments are emotional coincidences. Thérèse teaches otherwise. They are invitations. They are God saying, "I am still here. I have never left. Come back to me." And here is the deepest part. God does not send these moments to reward holiness. He sends them to rescue longing, to awaken desire, to stir memory, to call the soul home. But what happens after this grace appears? What does God do when the soul hesitates or responds or turns away again? After the moment of surprising grace breaks through the numbness, God does something incredibly delicate. Something that Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood with a clarity that feels almost prophetic. She recognized that the soul, once awakened even slightly, becomes fragile, tender, uncertain. It is like a child waking from a deep sleep, blinking, confused, unsure whether to rise or pull the blanket back over its head. And so, the seventh thing God does when a soul stops listening, but begins to awaken, is this. He approaches with extraordinary gentleness, adapting Himself to the soul's pace, not demanding immediate transformation. For Thérèse, God is never impatient. He does not rush the soul. He does not push it forward. He accompanies it. She wrote, "God takes us as we are, and little by little, He makes us what He desires." This, little by little, is not poetic. It is theological. Thérèse believed deeply that spiritual life grows like a flower, not like a machine. It cannot be forced, accelerated, or engineered. It must unfold. Imagine a moment when the soul feels the spark again. Just a little, a softness in prayer, a tiny longing, a gentle tug toward God. The soul does not yet know what to do with it. Should it pray? Should it repent? Should it feel guilty for forgetting God? Should it take some dramatic step? God says none of these things. Instead, He whispers, "Take one small step, just one." Thérèse understood this better than anyone. She believed that when a soul turns even slightly toward God, He responds immediately, not with demands, but with accommodations. He adjusts His approach. He simplifies His invitations. He reduces His requests. He moves slowly, patiently, tenderly, matching the soul's fragile capacity. Picture Thérèse herself during a moment of spiritual dryness. She suddenly feels a brief desire to pray, but only for a second. Instead of forcing herself into long, intense prayer, she simply whispers a small phrase of love, a childlike offering, a moment of sincerity. That was enough. More than enough. That was exactly what God desired. This is how God treats the awakening soul. If the soul can take only one step, God celebrates that one step. If the soul can offer only one word, God treasures that one word. If the soul can only sigh toward heaven, God receives that sigh as a prayer. Thérèse believed that the smallest movement toward God has infinite value because it is born from freedom. And love built on freedom is the only love God desires. But here lies a hidden challenge. Sometimes the soul awakens, but hesitates. It fears returning fully. It fears failing again. It fears the cost of listening. And sometimes after the moment of grace, the soul drifts again into distraction or numbness. What does God do then? This leads us to the 8th revelation, one of the most moving insights in Thérèse's spirituality. God begins to pursue the soul with a love more persistent than the soul's resistance. When the soul awakens for a moment, only to hesitate, withdraw, or fall silent again, God does not grow weary. He does not sigh in disappointment. He does not step back in resignation. Instead, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux reveals something astonishing. God pursues the soul with a love more patient than the soul's resistance. This pursuit is unlike any human pursuit. It is not forceful. It is not dramatic. It is not anxious. It is steady, persistent, silent, faithful. It is the love of a God who never gives up on even the smallest spark inside a human heart. Thérèse believed that God counts even the tiniest movements of the soul as victories of grace. She wrote, "Jesus does not look at the greatness of our actions, but at the love with which we do them." So when the soul, after receiving a moment of grace, drifts again, God does not read this as rejection. He reads it as fragility, as human weakness, as a heart that wants to return, but does not yet know how. And so he pursues. But how does he pursue? Not by chasing, not by overwhelming, not by frightening. He pursues with unbreakable gentleness, using 3 spiritual movements Thérèse knew well. First, God increases his hidden presence, even if you cannot feel him, even if your heart feels like stone, even if prayer is dry. God draws nearer in ways the soul cannot yet perceive. Thérèse often said that in her darkest moments, Jesus was closer than before, but he hid himself out of love. The hiddenness is not abandonment, it is protection, protection of freedom, protection of desire, protection of love's authenticity. Second, God continues offering small invitations, again and again and again. Even if the soul resists, he sends new opportunities, a sudden tenderness towards someone, a longing for peace, a discomfort with sin, a desire to pray that lasts only a second, a memory of grace that returns unexpectedly. These are not random. They are love letters, love attempts, love knocking softly on the door of a hesitant heart. Third, God waits, with a patience deeper than time. This is the most difficult truth for the human mind, yet the most comforting truth for the heart. God's patience outlives every resistance. Thérèse wrote, "God's patience is infinite. He waits for the smallest goodwill. He does not rush the soul. He does not threaten the soul. He simply waits with a love that never diminishes." Imagine Thérèse during her hardest spiritual nights. Her prayer feels empty. Her soul feels unresponsive. And yet she whispers, "Even when I feel nothing, I know you wait for me." This is the little way, trusting in God's patience more than in your own strength. And here lies the deepest revelation. When a soul stops listening, when it drifts, when it hesitates, when it is spiritually numb, God is not discouraged. He continues loving. He continues waiting. He continues pursuing in silence. Because God does not measure your spiritual life by your consistency. He measures it by your desire. And desire, even the weakest desire, is enough for him to work wonders in the soul. Saint Thérèse reveals that the story never ends with silence. The soul may stop listening, but God never stops loving. And eventually, even the quietest, faintest opening in the heart becomes a doorway through which grace enters again. God always finds his way back into the soul, and he always makes room for the soul to find its way back to him.